Welcome, Dr. Brian Walker. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. I just keen to run through a few questions with you. First up is the issue of cannabis and driving. And as I see it, it's the biggest issue facing Western Australian medical cannabis patients, many of whom are suffering chronic pain, are being asked not to drive. And I feel that they're being discriminated against, particularly when they're not impaired. And I've just wanted to get your opinion on what actually needs to change for this. Is it legislative change or a directive by the police minister? And what have they done in other jurisdictions to solve the problem?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that it is our absolute demand that no one should drive while impaired. And also to establish that currently the government allows people to drive while impaired. So we've got actually, if you're driving with 0.048 alcohol, you've actually got a 2 to 300% increased chance of an accident. If you're driving sleep impaired, you have a driving equivalent of about 0.08 of alcohol. And that's simply unacceptable. Now, the question then comes is, how can we deal with this? And the first thing I would say is that we ought to treat cannabis like any other prescribed medication. Now, if I was to give you, well, you know better than I do, you're a pharmacist. If I was to give you the Valium, for example, for your anxiety, there's going to be an effect on your ability, your cognitive ability, as well as your driving ability. Your antidepressants, your antipsychotics, which are often given for non-psychotic issues. Your antihistamines would be there, but also, tragically, also the opiates, which are opioids used for pain. Now, people are driving then while technically they may be impaired. And the advice is if you're impaired, don't drive. And we would simply like that same to be applied to medical cannabis. If you're impaired, don't drive. Now, we know that driving with cannabis in your system can impair, but we also know with absolute certainty that the impairment is of a short lasting duration. Now, the police in Queensland even had a poster about this, which said that it's maybe 4 hours later, but we can still test you and find that you have had cannabis. And this is when cannabis was only ever illicit. So they knew full well, 20 years ago, that driving with cannabis is not generally causing a problem with impairment. They knew that. They still know it. And also, police officers are very well equipped to detect impairment with their skills that they're taught, actually, in their police training and their experience on the roads. So, giving police the right to actually look at cars, how they're being driven on the road, and stopping people who may be driving while impaired and testing for impairment is appropriate. But we don't have enough police on the roads because they're doing something else. How could we fix this problem? Well, first of all, treat cannabis like any other medicine, as in Tasmania. Now, the experience internationally, and indeed in Tasmania, is that if you allow people to drive unimpaired with cannabis, there is no change in the road statistics. I've actually written to the select committee, to the not select committee, to the premier and the ministers, suggesting that we ought to cut the current legal limit for alcohol from 0.05 to 0.02 and save lives, because that would be a major step. That would save lives. And then to treat cannabis like any other prescribed medication. That would be simple to do. Now, we've also got the Victorian testing they're doing, giving the magistrates the permission not to blanket charge and fine people driving with THC if they're not impaired. And that's a trial that's going to go on for 2 years. And I fully expect that in Western Australia, after this current election, the Premier is going to must negotiate with other parties, including ourselves. And for us, THC driving is number one of our agenda.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's important to note, unlike alcohol, which is water soluble, cannabis is fat soluble and can be in your system for up to 2 months. And it's not as simple as a roadside breath test like alcohol. It's a bit more complicated, but yeah. And I understand also there's an app for testing impairment that might make it easier for law enforcement.
Well, there are several that we could use, but I'm actually looking at US development of apps which can give a measured amount of impairment while driving using technology at the roadside, but that's not available yet. But we have to also be aware that there's a vast difference between the urine testing, which is completely inappropriate, and the roadside tongue testing, which might be of assistance, but generally is not. There's no correlation between presence of THC and impairment that we know from countless studies. But the bigger question from once the roadside testing is sorted and people can drive while unimpaired using cannabis, I would be suggesting the next big problem is the FIFO workers who are being tested using a urine test and then stating, because we test positive, therefore you're impaired, therefore we're going to sack you or discipline you. Or just yesterday I had a problem with a patient with that same problem. But they're not actually testing for the presence of active THC. They're testing for a metabolite which doesn't have any psychoactive properties at all. And then they're saying, and because you got that, therefore you're impaired. The whole thing is just absolutely wrong.
Imagine if they tested for alcohol for up to 2 months later, we'd have no workers left in our FIFO industry. So,
well, they have caused a massive methamphetamine addiction crisis in Western Australia with this stupid law. And
that's a
that
whole other
is
story.
costing, I don't know how much in the way of a human toll, but also a financial toll to our state. And they haven't been held accountable for that stupidity. And we should hold them accountable.
Yeah. On to my next question. The fledgling West Australian hemp industry needs some help. It's just as got as probably as much, if not more, potential than the medical industry, but it needs government support. Have you seen any opportunities in this sector?
Huge opportunities. Let's first of all quantify. The calculation internationally is that the industrial hemp industry is 95% of the total cannabis industry. 95%. So the 1.25 billion government revenue we could achieve over the 4-year forward estimates already just by legalizing recreational cannabis mirror that into industrial hemp potential. No, there's about 20, maybe 30,000 different uses for hemp industrially used. There's a whole host of reasons. And the whole industry is being stymied by a government which has created senseless regulations. And the question is, why? What's the underlying cause? They're frightened of THC, which hasn't killed anyone, actually. But because they've got this fear of THC, they've actually put in restrictions to the whole use of industrial hemp. And therefore, they're preventing the establishment of an industry. Now, what we need is the industry to actually create the business, create the market, do the market research, and find huge potential there, and let the government simply step out of the way. That's what we really want to do, because government has no place in creating revenue. All they can do is spend money. They don't actually create money. That's business. Now, it was just last weekend, I was actually talking with Gary Rogers in Margaret River, and there's a modular system with using ColourBond and hemp infill that can be put together by a teenager over 8 days. You can build a complete house, pad, house and furnishings for about $80,000. I wonder.
Excited to see that, yeah.
I wonder if that would help our housing crisis. Do you think?
Absolutely, and I've had first-hand experiences with houses that Gary builds, and he does a really great job, so I'm sure it'll be amazing.
Well, your wonderful house actually is built in a more traditional way using hempcrete. This actually is a modular system using ColourBond to create two structures there, click it together. It's just a matter of days to put it together, and infilling with hemp. And it's such a quick and easy, and we could do this now. I mean, today we could start this, if only they would get out of the way. My favorite story is the ADF. They're building bomb-proof covers for motors using hemp and carbon fiber. Bomb-proof. Okay. We could send this into space. Look, the innovative potential for hemp. We could balance our export trades using iron ore as an example. We could actually equal that or far extend that just by using hemp as an innovative product.
Mm-hmm. Exciting. Another really exciting area is cannabis medical research. I understand there's about 100 different medical studies in Australia. As a prescribing doctor, day to day, you treat patients. What areas would you like to see studied to benefit patients the most?
Well, first of all, we need to expand what we're currently doing. The doctors who are extensively using cannabis are making their own discoveries. For example, those of us who are high prescribers know that children with autistic spectrum disorder and ADHD have immense benefits often from just the non-THC cannabinoids, but also with a small tickle of THC, we're getting fantastic results. Not for all, of course. It's not a cure-all, but the parents are saying this is the best medication out of all the stuff they've had from the psychiatrists. This is the best for their child, or the most progress that's achieved. So we ought to really expand research into autism, autistic spectrum disorder, and ADHD. And that's, I think, an amazing area. Another area where we do need a lot of research is this the question about how do you manage cancer? There's two aspects there, of course. One is how do you manage the symptoms of cancer, and cannabis is absolutely wonderful in combination with others, but also on its own in palliative care, or indeed simply people who have got a diagnosis of cannabis and are anxious and very upset about this and very fearful. Cannabis can greatly enhance the quality of their life, and that would, I think, contribute to their overall chances of recovery. But the other one here is the stories we're getting here of miraculous cures from those who've been using cannabis. And this hasn't properly been quantified. We have anecdotal evidence, but we really need to quantify that with proper studies. And that's where we need to be. Did you know, by the way, that our office here is collecting about 4,000 studies annually on cannabis? And that's only the high quality studies. So 4,000. So 100 in Australia is actually a small fry. We need to actually greatly increase that.
Absolutely. And one I would add to that, and I've seen a lot of potential, is cannabis for dementia patients. There's currently no cure or treatment for dementia patients, short of tranquilizing them quite heavily, so they've got no quality of life. But yeah, certainly.
But dementia is fascinating, actually. Well, I'll rephrase that. So the management of dementia can be fascinating. My experience is that treating patients with advanced dementia using cannabis, the progress of disease is slowed. This is actually a universal truth for cannabis use. The question is, can we prevent, if you have say, you take a metabolic test and discover you have a higher chance of getting dementia based on your genetics and your family history, would administering cannabinoids of whatever form slow the onset or indeed prevent the onset of dementia? That is fascinating. We really ought to take that seriously because we know the burden of dementia is high and increasing. Now, you could argue that part of that is our unhealthy lifestyles with the food processing industry. Yes, we could do that, but we're not going to fix that quickly. What we can do is start using cannabis more frequently for those who are at risk of quite major issues. We could look at other things, for example, the anecdotal evidence of Parkinson's disease. Would that be helped? Yes, we've got very good anecdotal evidence, but not nearly enough in the way of trials to look at this. And do you know what? There's another area I really want research to go into. We all have an endocannabinoid system. There's a potential for the endocannabinoid deficiency disorder, but that hasn't really properly been looked at. So the question is, some of the diagnoses we're making currently in orthodox medicine and we're applying our fixes with the current pharmacopoeia, would we be better off looking at the endocannabinoid system for those less treatable illnesses and discovering perhaps if we balance the endocannabinoid system, we get better outcomes? That needs to be looked at.
To see some robust studies in all those areas. So thank you very much for your time this morning, Dr. Brian Walker. As always, it's been fascinating.
A real pleasure.
And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Good luck for the election.
Thank you.
Authorised by F. Mulholland, Legalise Cannabis WA.